The stench reached the throne before the man himself. Even the finest perfumes of Arabia, the burning incense of English cathedrals, and the scattered herbs of palace chambers could not mask it. Courtiers pressed pomanders to their noses, their faces pale, their eyes watering as the King of England entered. Behind velvet robes and gold chains of office, behind the image of majesty carefully painted on canvas, lay a body that was rotting while still alive. The figure who had once been hailed as the handsomest prince in Christendom was now swollen, diseased, and consumed by infection. King Henry VIII, terror of nobles and tormentor of queens, had become a living corpse. It had not always been so. In his youth, Henry was the embodiment of Renaissance glory. He rode with unmatched skill, jousted with ferocity, sang and composed, debated theology with scholars, and spoke languages with ease. Foreign ambassadors described him as radiant, powerful, destined for greatness. Yet behind the splendor of tournaments and feasts, fate prepared a slow and merciless undoing. The very games that displayed his strength would one day break his body, twist his mind, and drive him into madness. The turning point came on a cold January afternoon in 1536. At Greenwich Palace, before an eager crowd, Henry thundered down the tilt-yard astride his armored warhorse. The ground shook beneath the charge, lances aimed with deadly precision. Then came the crash. Two great beasts collided, steel shattered, and England's monarch was hurled to the frozen earth. A destrier's armored bulk collapsed upon him, crushing flesh and bone. The crowd fell silent. For 2 hours, England waited without a king. 2 hours when Anne Boleyn, heavy with the child she hoped would secure her place, paced in anguish. 2 hours when courtiers whispered of succession and prayed for survival. Henry awoke, but he was not the same. Witnesses said the light in his eyes had altered. No longer the brightness of a learned prince, but the shadowed gaze of a man who saw threats in every corner. His first words were not gratitude for life, but fury that the games had been stopped. From that moment forward, something dark coiled in his mind. Physicians of our age would call it traumatic injury to the brain, a wound to the seat of temper and judgment. His contemporaries called it wrath. The gentle charm that had once made him beloved was gone. In its place rose a tyrant whose suspicion and cruelty would define the last decade of his reign. The accident had not only changed his mind, it tore open an old wound in his leg, a wound that never closed again. From it seeped the long decay that poisoned his body day by day. In a world without the knowledge of infection, the sore became a doorway to death. It swelled into ulcers that wept constantly, filling basins with foul fluid, soaking through bandages until the stench was unbearable. Servants fled their duties, priests gagged during blessings, and noblemen excused themselves from audiences to vomit in corners. Henry ordered the wounds pressed with heavy devices of his own design, believing pressure might close them. Instead, the flesh blackened, circulation faltered, and the corruption deepened. Yet he hid it behind masks of power. Painters were ordered to show him with strong legs planted wide, the famous stance that still defines his image. He drenched himself in oils of rose and amber, but no perfume could silence decay. His courtiers dared not speak of it, though the smell betrayed him at every step. What the king's pride concealed, his body revealed, infection that crept into his blood, fever that burned through nights, and pain that never ceased. The disease of the body fed the disease of the mind. The toxins gnawed at his brain, and the man who once danced till dawn now lurked in chambers of shadow, lashing out with rage. One moment tears fell from his eyes, the next he roared for executions. Anne Boleyn fell within months of the accident, her head struck from her shoulders by the same fury that boiled in his veins. Friends became traitors, servants became spies in his imagination, and England learned that no one was safe in the presence of its king. By the 1540s, the Golden Prince had vanished entirely. In his place was a monstrous figure, vast in size, racked by pain, and haunted by visions. His frame expanded beyond armor and furniture alike, doorways widened and floors reinforced to carry his weight. He was dressed lying flat, lifted with pulleys, carried in hidden chairs. The throne itself strained beneath him, Yet he ruled with the same iron will, his body collapsing even as his authority grew. What dignity remained dissolved in whispers of ghosts. Ambassadors wrote of moments when the king spoke to unseen figures, berating Anne Boleyn's spectre, pleading with his dead mother, conversing with his long-dead brother Arthur. At feasts, he screamed at empty chairs, calling them enemies and witches, then returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. Courtiers devised signals to warn one another of his moods. Red ribbons for rage, black for despair, white for fleeting calm. They lived not by law or order, but by the shifting storms of a dying tyrant's mind. And all the while, the stench grew stronger. The ulcers deepened, turning from pale discharge to foul corruption. By 1546, flesh around the wounds turned black. Servants fainted as they changed his linens. Incense burned without pause, yet could not cleanse the air. Henry had become the embodiment of rot, his body a battlefield of infection, his mind consumed by shadows. But the true horror lay not in life alone. It would follow him into death. The winter of 1546 cast its shadow over Whitehall Palace, and with it, the shadow of Henry's mortality. He was 55 years old, but in appearance and health he was ancient, broken, and monstrous. The man who had once cut the figure of a Renaissance prince now sat swollen and immobile upon a throne that seemed too small for his vast, distorted frame. His eyes, once likened to the summer skies of England, had turned yellow and dull, sunk deep into swollen flesh. His breathing was labored, every word a rasp. Yet courtiers still bowed low, still addressed him as Majesty, even as they clutched pomanders to their noses to endure his presence. Henry's court had become a theater of fear. The Privy Council walked on a knife's edge, wary of every command. Servants moved silently, for the king's moods turned in an instant. He would break into laughter at a jest, then order the jester's imprisonment moments later. At times he muttered of poison in his food, demanding that servants taste every drop of medicine and press every ointment upon their own skin before it touched his. The man who had once torn monasteries apart now believed demons crawled from beneath his bed. His fury had become his court's law, his madness their nightmare. The ulcers on his legs, long a torment, reached their final stage of horror. Physicians described them in secret notes as wounds that revealed bone, the flesh around them black with decay. The smell was unbearable, filling the chambers even when windows were thrown wide to the bitter January air. It clung to tapestries, to clothing, to the very stone of the palace. Nothing could banish it. Servants fainted during their duties, nobles excused themselves, and never returned. Yet none dared speak aloud what everyone knew. Their king was rotting alive. In his last days, Henry drifted between moments of clarity and visions of terror. He called for his mother, long dead, begging her to protect him. He pleaded with his brother Arthur for forgiveness. Most hauntingly, he whispered to Catherine of Aragon, the wife he had cast aside, asking her pardon for his betrayal. At other times, his eyes fixed on shadows in the room, and he cried out against apparitions of his victims. Anne Boleyn's name echoed in his chambers, her phantom laughter tormenting him. One evening he rose with difficulty, supported by many hands, and shouted at an empty chair, demanding that the witch leave his sight. His courtiers sat frozen, watching their monarch rage at nothing. When he sank back into his seat, drenched in sweat, he carried on as though nothing had occurred. By January 1547, his body began to collapse completely. His tongue swelled so that speech was nearly impossible, words emerging as gargled moans. His abdomen bloated with fluid, pressing against his organs until each breath was agony. His urine turned dark, his skin jaundiced, his swollen limbs cracked and wept fluid through bandages. The physicians could do nothing but drain, bind, and pray. To Henry they promised recovery, but among themselves they confessed that the king was already at death's door. On the night of January 27th, his agony reached its peak. Seizures racked his massive body, convulsions so violent that 6 men struggled to hold him. Between the spasms, he vomited black bile, the last sign of his body's internal collapse. The smell drove even hardened courtiers from the chamber. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, stood at his side to administer last rites. He asked Henry to give a sign of faith. With great effort, the king squeezed the archbishop's hand once. Moments later, his grip went slack. At 2 in the morning, the man who had torn England from Rome, who had executed wives and friends alike, who had ruled with unmatched ferocity, was dead. Yet even in death, Henry VIII was not at peace. His body swelled with gases, decomposition racing through flesh already consumed by infection. The corpse grew so bloated that servants feared the coffin could not contain it. They rushed to embalm him, filling the body with salt, herbs, and tar, wrapping it in layers of cloth. They sealed him in a massive coffin of lead, so heavy it required 8 horses to pull. But no craft of man could halt the corruption that spread within. As the procession wound its way toward Windsor, winter rains turned the road to mire, and progress slowed. At Syon Abbey, once dissolved by Henry's command, the coffin was set down overnight in the chapel. There, legend and history intertwine. Witnesses claimed that the lid split open with a thunderous crack. Fluid seeped onto the chapel floor, filling the air with a stench so foul that guards fled their posts. By dawn, dogs had found their way inside. The servants who returned discovered the unthinkable, animals licking the fluids that had leaked from the coffin of a king. Whether every detail is true, or whether some were colored by rumor, the image endured. The man who had claimed divine right, who had fashioned himself God's anointed, had become food for beasts. The courtiers hastily resealed the coffin, shrouded it in cloth, and pressed on to Windsor. There, Henry was buried with ceremony, though far more hastily than planned. Proclamations declared his passing peaceful, yet whispers told otherwise. His courtiers swore silence under pain of death. But silence cannot hold forever. Diaries of foreign ambassadors, secret notes of physicians, and the whispered tales of servants carried the truth across centuries. The glorious prince, the architect of England's Reformation, had died not in majesty, but in horror. His reign ended as his body had ended, rotting, swollen, poisoned by its own corruption. What the artist concealed in flattering portraits, what officials concealed in proclamations, the body revealed in full. A king once seen as larger than life proved in death to be only flesh, as fragile and foul as any mortal. The coffin reached Windsor at last, drawn by weary horses through rain and mire. Inside, the lead shell groaned with the pressure of gases, cloth soaked with fluids, and a body that seemed determined to resist even death itself. Courtiers dared not speak of what had happened at Syon Abbey, though the rumor spread quickly through England. Some called it divine judgment, that the king who had torn down abbeys was humiliated within their walls. Others whispered it was the devil claiming what was his. Whatever the truth, the legend of Henry's corpse lived on, entwined forever with his legacy. In Windsor, the ceremonies went forward, though stripped of grandeur. No triumphal display of majesty could mask the truth. The greatest monarch of his age had died in terror, his body collapsing into corruption, his court scrambling to conceal what they could not control. They proclaimed that Henry had died peacefully, but those who had seen him knew otherwise. He had not slipped gently into the night. He had screamed, convulsed, begged for mercy from the ghosts of his past. His was not the passing of a king anointed by God, but the disintegration of a man cursed by his own deeds. Yet in the years that followed, his image was carefully remade. Portraits painted by Hans Holbein and others showed him broad, strong, unyielding, a colossus astride the throne of England. The stance, the glare, the bulk, all conveyed power. The ulcers were hidden, the pain erased, the madness silenced. Even in death, Henry commanded his courtiers, shaping the memory of his reign. His son and counselors suppressed the truth, knowing that England's stability depended upon it. For how could a kingdom be ruled by the son of a rotting tyrant? The myth of majesty had to endure, even as the body beneath Windsor's stones decayed into dust. Still, fragments of truth escaped. Diaries kept in secret, foreign reports carried across the channel, and the testimony of those who could not resist recording the horror they had witnessed. They spoke of the smell that choked the palace, the fluids that burst from the coffin, the dogs that licked the remains of a king. Myths grew from these accounts, whispered as judgment. God had punished the tyrant. The earth had rejected him. His own body had betrayed him. And so the Golden Prince became, in memory, a warning. Yet the question remains. Was Henry's decline only the work of disease, or was it the natural end of a man who had consumed everything around him? His reign began with promise, with art, music, learning, and the glow of youth. But power is a poison as dangerous as infection. With each execution, with each betrayal, with each severed marriage, he cut himself away from humanity until only the tyrant remained. His wounds, perhaps, were not only of the body, but of the spirit. The ulcers on his legs may have been fed as much by wrath and paranoia as by bacteria. The decay that filled his chamber was also the decay of a reign built on fear. In the silence of Windsor, the body of Henry VIII lay sealed in lead. Yet even sealed, the legend of his corruption seeped outward, staining history. His death was not peaceful, not majestic, not holy. It was grotesque, violent, humiliating. In that death lies a mirror for all power. Kings may command armies, rewrite laws, and remake churches, but in the end, they too are flesh, subject to rot, to fear, to the judgment of time. The myth of the glorious monarch endures, for men always crave the image of strength. But the truth lurks beneath, a truth as foul as the stench that filled Whitehall, a truth that courtiers could not perfume, that painters could not disguise, that even lead could not contain. The king who defied Rome, who remade England, who struck terror into queens and nobles alike, died not as a ruler, but as a man undone. His story is a reminder that power cannot silence decay, that fear cannot banish truth, that no throne, no crown, no empire can protect the flesh from time and corruption. And so Henry VIII lives on, not only in portraits of grandeur but in whispers of horror, not only as the tyrant of England but as the man who became his own legend of rot. Imagine the silence of that final chamber, the flickering torches, the hushed voices of servants binding cloth upon a body that burst apart in their hands. Imagine the court that proclaimed majesty while gagging on stench. Imagine the dogs in the Abbey chapel, lapping at what had once been royal flesh. This is not the death of myth. This is the truth behind the mask. And so we are left with one question, echoing through the centuries. If even a king who claimed divine right can die in filth and terror, what hope does any mortal have to escape the corruption of power and the certainty of decay?